Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we plunge into the murky depths of the Victorian era, a time when life was short, disease was rampant, and death wasn't just a part of life, it was practically a lifestyle. Imagine, for a moment, the world outside your window goes silent. The streetlights flicker and die, and a heavy velvet black stillness settles over everything. The air grows thick with the scent of lilies and cold wax. You find yourself standing not in your bedroom, but in a dimly lit Victorian parlour, the air heavy with an unspoken sorrow. On the mantelpiece, a small, sombre locket hangs, not with a picture of a loved one, but with a lock of their hair. This isn't just a memento, it's an active daily reminder of mortality. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorians had what can only be described as a profoundly peculiar relationship with death. It wasn't a taboo subject to be whispered about behind closed doors. It was an all-consuming cultural event, a performance of grief played out on a public stage. The reasons for this are as complex as a Dickens novel, a confluence of factors: high infant mortality rates, devastating epidemics like cholera and tuberculosis, and a deeply ingrained religious piety created a society where death was a constant, unwelcome guest. You, as a Victorian, would have been expected to be intimately familiar with it from a young age. The average life expectancy was a stark reality, and this constant proximity to the end gave rise to some truly bizarre and fascinating obsessions. One of the most mainstream historical facts about the era's death culture is the sheer length and complexity of the mourning period. Mourning wasn't a casual affair. It was a rigidly structured social contract. For a widow, the first year was deep mourning, a period of total social withdrawal where you were expected to wear black from head to toe, including a crepe veil that often made it difficult to see or breathe. This was followed by a less restrictive second mourning, and finally half mourning, where you could introduce shades of grey, lavender or purple. The entire process could last up to 2.5 years. The rules were so strict that a woman who failed to adhere to them risked social ostracism. It was a visible sign of your piety and your love for the deceased. A man's mourning period was, of course, far shorter and less restrictive, because of course it was. He just needed to wear a black armband. The double standard was as apparent then as it is now, but it wasn't just about wearing black. The Victorians had a quirky or fringe tidbit of a practice known as memento mori, which translates to remember you must die. This wasn't a morbid or depressing thought for them, but rather a motivating one. It was a reminder to live a virtuous life because the end was always near. Memento mori took many forms, from simple skull carvings on tombstones to more personal and intricate items. You might find a locket with a lock of hair and a tiny skeleton etched on the reverse, or a pocket watch with a skull painted on the face. These were not just macabre decorations, they were philosophical tools, small personal reminders of the fragility of existence. It's a bit like having a carpe diem tattoo, but instead of a bird, it's a decaying corpse. Now let's talk about the big one, the one that makes everyone a little squeamish: post-mortem photography. You've probably seen the haunting, faded black and white images of Victorians with their eyes closed, looking strangely serene, surrounded by family. Sometimes the photos are of a child posed with their favourite doll, propped up in a chair as if sleeping. While this practice seems ghoulish to us now, for the Victorians, it was a perfectly logical and deeply emotional way to remember their loved ones. Photography was a new and expensive technology, and for many, a post-mortem photograph was the only image they would ever have of a deceased child or family member. It was a way to capture a final, peaceful likeness. It was an act of love, not a sign of a sick obsession. Historians still argue whether the practice of propping up a deceased person to make them look alive was common, or just a particularly jarring trend. Some believe it was a way to cope with the finality of death, a desperate attempt to create a last memory of them as they were in life. Others argue that it was often a simple matter of posing the body to look its best, just as you would for any portrait. The debate reflects a broader scholarly discussion about how to interpret historical practices through a modern lens without projecting our own cultural taboos. The Victorians didn't just passively mourn, they actively commemorated. Cemeteries became grand, sprawling parks, garden cemeteries, designed for promenading and quiet contemplation. Places like Highgate Cemetery in London weren't just burial grounds, they were tourist attractions, a way to connect with the great minds of the past. The monuments weren't simple headstones, they were elaborate sculptures, mausoleums and obelisks, each one a testament to the family's wealth and status. It was a fascinating blend of public display and private grief. You would pack a picnic basket, put on your finest clothes, still black of course, and spend a Sunday afternoon strolling among the dead. The silence and solemnity were seen as conducive to deep thought and a connection with the spiritual world. The Victorians, with their strict social codes and deeply repressed public emotions, found an outlet for their feelings in these bizarre and beautiful rituals. They had to, because public displays of emotion like crying were often seen as unseemly. Instead, they channeled their grief into these elaborate performative actions. The memento mori, the long mourning periods, the post-mortem photos, all of it was a way to make sense of the senseless, to create order in the face of chaos, and to find a way to remember and honour those who had been taken too soon. It's a very human impulse, dressed up in a very Victorian style. It's easy to laugh at it from our perspective, but if you put yourself in their shoes, you see that it was all born from a profound and universal feeling, the need to mourn and to remember. You can't help but admire the sheer commitment, the commitment to a life of sorrow, for a couple of years at least. Sounds pretty exhausting, doesn't it? Now that you've mentally filed away the rules of Victorian mourning, and perhaps feel a little grateful you can just wear a sad-looking black t-shirt to a funeral today, let's talk about a fascination that takes the macabre to a whole new, dusty level. From the sombre parlour with its air of perpetual sadness, we're now moving to a world of ancient curses, long-dead pharaohs, and the rather unsettling practice of unearthing and displaying the remains of a civilization thousands of years old. The Victorian obsession with ancient Egypt was a perfect storm of colonialism, scientific curiosity, and a deep-seated love for the exotic and the morbid. It all started, as many things did in the 19th century, with a bit of a colonial grab. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign at the end of the 18th century had already whetted Europe's appetite, but it was the British who really took the fascination and ran with it. The discovery of tombs and artefacts by adventurous explorers and archaeologists, and let's be honest, often grave robbers, ignited a craze known as Egyptomania. Suddenly, ancient Egypt wasn't just a biblical reference. It was a tangible, exotic world that promised untold treasures and forbidden knowledge. You, as a Victorian, would have found yourself surrounded by it. Sphinxes on mantelpieces, scarab beetles on brooches, and hieroglyphs on everything from furniture to wallpaper. It was a stylish, high-class way to demonstrate your worldliness and your appreciation for history. But the most mainstream historical fact of this obsession, the one that truly sets it apart, was the public's morbid appetite for mummy unwrapping parties. This was not a hushed academic affair. It was entertainment, plain and simple. Imagine getting an invitation to a social gathering. You'd expect tea, a bit of gossip, maybe a piano recital. Instead, you're gathered in a grand drawing room, the air thick with anticipation. In the centre of the room, on a specially prepared table, lies a genuine ancient Egyptian mummy. A charismatic Egyptologist, or surgeon, often Thomas Pettigrew, nicknamed Mummy Pettigrew, would then begin the slow theatrical process of unwrapping the linen bandages, layer by excruciating layer. As the dusty bandages came off, the crowd would gasp and lean forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the preserved body underneath. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but for the Victorians, it was a thrilling, educational and rather ghoulish night out. It was a perfect blend of scientific inquiry and morbid curiosity. The truly strange and quirky tidbit of this particular obsession is the use of mummy brown paint. Yes, you heard that right. An actual paint pigment made from ground-up mummified human remains. For centuries, mumia, as it was called, had been used as a medicinal powder, believed to cure everything from stomach ailments to the plague. By the Victorian era, however, its use had shifted to the art world. Artists loved its rich, dark brown hue, and it was said to be perfect for creating deep shadows and moody landscapes. You could literally be looking at a beautiful Victorian landscape, perhaps a serene view of the countryside, and know that the dark, foreboding shadows were painted with the remains of an ancient Egyptian. The colour's popularity eventually waned in the early 20th century, as people started to realise the rather grim implications of what they were painting with. It's a fantastic, slightly unsettling piece of trivia. One artist, Edward Burne-Jones, is said to have buried his tube of mummy brown paint in his garden after learning of its true origin. Bit of a shock to the system, I imagine. The mummy obsession wasn't just about entertainment and art supplies, it also tied into the era's burgeoning spiritualism, which we'll get to in the next section. Many believed that the mummified remains contained the spirits of the deceased, and that handling them could bring about strange and supernatural phenomena. Grave robbers and collectors, driven by greed, would often ignore pleas from locals and scientists alike, believing the myths of curses to be mere superstition. You see, the Victorian mind was a curious place. It was highly rational and scientific one moment, embracing the new theories of Darwin and the marvels of the Industrial Revolution, and deeply superstitious the next, with a genuine belief in ghosts and curses. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were truly spiritual seekers or simply thrill seekers looking for an excuse to indulge in the paranormal. The mummy unwrapping parties were a prime example of this duality. Were they a serious scientific endeavour or just a ghoulish spectacle? The answer is probably a bit of both. The craze for all things Egyptian also led to the widespread fabrication of fake mummies. As the demand for artefacts grew, so did the supply of forgeries. Craftsmen in Egypt would skillfully create mummies by wrapping newly deceased humans, or sometimes even animals, in old bandages and distressing them to look ancient. These were then sold to gullible tourists and collectors eager to possess a piece of the past. The demand was so high, and the scrutiny so low, that a surprisingly large number of these fakes made their way into private collections and museums across Europe and America. It was a business built on deception, preying on the romantic and uncritical Victorian imagination. You could be admiring a mummy in a prestigious museum today that a few years ago might have been a recently deceased cat. It's a hilarious and slightly gross thought. The allure of the mummy was powerful because it spoke to so many Victorian anxieties and desires. It represented a triumph of man over time, a victory of science over decay. It was a physical link to a long-dead civilization, a way to touch and feel a history that felt so far away. Yet, it was also a grim reminder of their own mortality, a literal memento mori on a grand scale. The contrast between the solemn piety of their own death rituals and the rather cavalier attitude towards the dead of another culture is a testament to the Victorians' strange and inconsistent worldview. It's a lot to process, isn't it? One moment you're weeping over a relative's locket of hair, the next you're cheering as a 5,000-year-old body is unceremoniously unwrapped for your amusement. You have to admit it was never boring. The sheer, unadulterated weirdness of it all is captivating. And so, as we leave the dusty candlelit drawing room and the slightly unsettling thought of powdered pharaohs, you're left to ponder the true cost of curiosity. Was the pursuit of knowledge worth the sacrilege? Was the thrill of the grotesque simply a symptom of a society grappling with its own mortality? These are the questions that make the Victorian era so compelling and so utterly bizarre. As the last dusty bandage falls from the mummified pharaoh, or perhaps a long-dead cat from a modern forgery, you can feel the air in the room shift. The morbid fascination with the dead wasn't just about physical remains, it was also about the lingering, unseen presence of the departed. The Victorians, so obsessed with death, couldn't help but wonder if the end was truly the end. This profound grief, coupled with a deep-seated desire for answers in an age of rapid scientific advancement, fueled one of the most widespread and bizarre movements of the era: spiritualism. It was a belief system and a social phenomenon that promised a bridge to the other side, a chance to communicate with the spirits of loved ones who had passed on. Imagine the quiet solemnity of your Victorian parlour again, but this time the scent of lilies and cold wax is replaced by the cloying sweetness of incense. The gaslight is turned down low, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. You sit around a mahogany table with a group of friends, your hands resting lightly on its polished surface. All of you are silent, a nervous anticipation humming in the air. This isn't a funeral, it's a séance. A medium, a woman in a heavy velvet dress, sits at the head of the table, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and deliberate. You wait. A knock. 1, 2, 3 knocks. A voice, a strange disembodied whisper, seems to come from the ether. "It is I," the whisper says, "your dear departed Aunt Gertrude." And just like that, you're in the heart of the Victorian spiritualist craze. The most mainstream historical fact about spiritualism is its undeniable popularity. It was a global phenomenon, captivating millions across Europe and America. What started with the Fox sisters in upstate New York in 1848, who claimed to communicate with a spirit through a series of knocks, quickly snowballed into a bona fide religion and form of entertainment. The movement found a receptive audience among the grieving, the curious, and the wealthy. It provided a sense of comfort and control in a world where life was so precarious. After all, if you could just ask a spirit what was happening on the other side, the terrifying unknown of death suddenly seemed a little less frightening. It was also an empowering space for women, who often served as the mediums and seers. They were able to gain a level of authority and influence that was largely denied to them in other aspects of Victorian society. It's a bit like the original social network, but for connecting with people who have already passed away. You just had to hope their Wi-Fi signal was strong enough from the afterlife. The really quirky or fringe tidbit of spiritualism, however, lies in its bizarre and often theatrical manifestations. It wasn't just about knocks and whispers. There was a whole arsenal of parlour tricks and spectacles. We're talking about spirit photography, where mediums would claim to capture images of ghosts hovering behind the living. You'd go to a photographer, sit for a portrait, and when the picture was developed, a faint ghostly figure, often a deceased relative, would appear behind you. These were, of course, double exposures, a simple photographic trick, but to the believers, they were irrefutable proof of the spirit world. Then there was ectoplasm, a gooey, cheesecloth-like substance that mediums would supposedly excrete from their orifices to manifest spirits. It was a gross, but very convincing spectacle. One medium, a woman named Florence Cook, was famous for materializing the spirit of a deceased woman named Katie King, who would walk around the room and interact with the attendees. The fact that Katie King looked an awful lot like Florence's sister was, of course, a mere coincidence. The sheer variety and absurdity of these tricks, from levitating tables to spirit trumpets that delivered messages from the dead, are a testament to the gullibility of the age and the genius of the performers. The spiritualist movement wasn't just for the masses, it also attracted some of the era's most brilliant minds. Men of science like Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, and even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the hyper-rational Sherlock Holmes, were devout believers. They saw no conflict between their scientific pursuits and their belief in the supernatural. For them, spiritualism was simply an undiscovered branch of science, a new field waiting to be explored. This brings us to a crucial scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether spiritualism was a genuine religious movement, a form of psychological therapy, or simply a widespread fraud. On one hand, you have the countless letters and accounts from believers who found genuine comfort and solace in the idea that their loved ones were not truly gone. For them, it was a profound and deeply personal experience. On the other hand, you have the well-documented debunkings by magicians like Harry Houdini, who spent a significant portion of his career exposing the frauds and charlatans who preyed on the grieving. He saw it as a moral crusade, and his exposés revealed that the ectoplasm was often just cheesecloth. The spirit knocks were joint-popping tricks, and the levitating tables were lifted with cleverly hidden wires. The debate centres on intent. Were the mediums true believers in their own abilities, or were they cynical con artists? And did the truth even matter to those who were desperate for hope? The spiritualist séance wasn't just a grim or theatrical affair, it was also a deeply social one. People would meet in each other's homes, forming a kind of ghostly salon. They would share stories, read spiritualist publications, and discuss the latest manifestations. It was a community, a way to connect with like-minded people in a society that could be isolating and unforgiving. The séance provided a safe space to discuss death, grief, and the great questions of the universe, all while pretending a chair was moving on its own. The atmosphere was a strange mix of solemnity and excitement, a little like a modern-day escape room, but with the added bonus of potential spectral communication. You, as an observer, would find it fascinating. The same society that was so rigid in its mourning etiquette. Remember that tedious 2.5-year mourning period we talked about? Was simultaneously throwing itself into a world of spectral visitations and séances. The contrast is jarring, but it makes perfect sense. The rigid public performance of grief had its limits. It couldn't provide the personal comfort that spiritualism promised. It couldn't bring back the voice of a lost child or the touch of a deceased spouse. Spiritualism, for all its charlatanry, offered a path to that emotional connection. It offered a sense of hope in a world of constant loss, and that, in the end, is perhaps the truest and most human reason for its success. The séance is over. The phantom knocks have faded, and the ectoplasm, or what you now suspect was simply a cleverly hidden piece of gauze, has been put away. As you stand up from the table, feeling a bit foolish and a little spooked, you realise the medium is wearing a simple, unadorned black dress. This isn't just a style choice, it's a uniform. The Victorians' peculiar fascination with death manifested in a very real, very public way, through the strict, sombre, and surprisingly elaborate rules of mourning fashion. It was an entire industry dedicated to the aesthetic of grief, a way to broadcast your sorrow without ever having to say a word. From the casual comfort of your modern clothes, you're now transported to a world of jet buttons, crepe veils, and heavy silks. The air in your room feels thick, not with sorrow, but with the suffocating weight of heavy fabrics. You imagine your closet, once a collection of colours and styles, is now a desolate sea of black. This wasn't a phase, it was a deeply ingrained social expectation. For the Victorians, clothes truly did make the man and the woman, and they were the primary visual language of social status, piety, and respectability. The way you mourned, and more specifically what you wore while doing it, was a performance with a very clear script. The most mainstream historical fact of Victorian mourning fashion is its precise and unforgiving structure. Queen Victoria herself set the gold standard. After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, she entered into a state of perpetual mourning for the remaining 40 years of her life. She was a fashion icon of grief, and the public, ever eager to emulate the monarchy, followed her lead. The rules of mourning were codified in countless etiquette guides and fashion magazines, and they were, frankly, exhausting. For a widow, the first year and a day was full mourning or deep mourning. Your outfit had to be made of plain black matte crepe, a heavy crimped silk, which was specifically chosen because it didn't reflect light, signalling a complete withdrawal from society's frivolous sparkle. No jewellery was allowed, save for a small brooch of jet or a lock of the deceased's hair. You were expected to wear a long, thick crepe veil that covered your face whenever you went outside, making it nearly impossible to be recognised. This veil, a symbol of your intense sorrow, was known as a widow's weed. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? As we discussed in the first section, after the first year and a day, you could transition to second mourning, where you could remove the crepe and wear more lustrous fabrics like silk and velvet. A small brooch of jet or a locket with the deceased's hair might be introduced. After 9 more months, you moved to ordinary mourning, which allowed for some small accents of white, grey or purple. The final 6 months were half mourning, where you could introduce a splash of colour. Lavender was a particularly popular choice. The full process could take up to 2.5 years, and any deviation from this strict schedule was a public sign of disrespect for the deceased. A woman who was seen wearing lavender before her mourning period was over would be gossiped about mercilessly and might find herself ostracised from polite society. The quirky and fringe tidbit of mourning fashion is the sheer amount of money and industry that was devoted to it. Because everyone, from the Queen down, was expected to participate, a massive mourning industry sprang up. There were specialised shops that sold nothing but mourning clothes, accessories and hats. You could buy widow's capes, mourning bonnets and special jet black undergarments. This wasn't just a high society trend. Even the middle and lower classes followed the rules as best they could, often dyeing their existing clothes black. The demand for mourning wear was so great that it was a huge economic driver. It was almost like a morbid version of the fast fashion industry. The raw material for these clothes, the crepe fabric, was a big business. It was rough to the touch and easily worn out, which meant you had to keep buying more of it throughout your long mourning period. The societal implications of this black obsession are still a point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this elaborate mourning display was a genuine expression of grief or a public performance of social status and wealth. On one hand, it's easy to see it as a reflection of genuine sorrow, a way to visibly process the pain of loss in a society that valued restraint. The heavy veil and sombre clothes were a physical barrier between the mourner and the outside world, a way to signal, I am not available for social pleasantries, I am grieving. On the other hand, the sheer cost and intricacy of the mourning wardrobe were a powerful status symbol. Only the wealthy could afford a full wardrobe of mourning clothes for a prolonged period. The widow who could afford to stay in deep mourning for 2 years was signalling to the world that she had the financial means to do so, while a working-class widow might only be able to afford a simple black dress for a few months. It was a visible class signifier, a way to perform your grief in a way that also performed your social standing. So, was the sorrow real? Absolutely. Was the mourning fashion also a subtle, or not-so-subtle way to show off? Probably. You had to grieve with style, you see. Beyond the clothes, the Victorians' obsession with death extended to their accessories. We'll delve into the full strange world of hair jewellery later, but for now, let's focus on jet jewellery. Jet is a fossilised wood that is lightweight and can be carved and polished to a brilliant shiny black. It became the quintessential mourning jewellery. It was sober enough to be worn during the strictest stages of mourning, but also elegant enough to be a status symbol. You'd see jet necklaces, brooches and earrings, all intricately carved with mourning motifs like weeping willows or doves. The Victorians' love affair with black wasn't just about funerals and mourning periods. Black was also a fashionable colour in its own right, signifying seriousness and sophistication. However, the ubiquity of mourning wear meant that even a simple black dress could be misinterpreted. You had to be careful. A fashionable black ensemble could be mistaken for a sign of a recent bereavement. It was a fashion minefield. One minute you're trying to look chic and refined, the next you're getting pitying looks from strangers because they think your spouse just died. A bit of a buzzkill, wouldn't you say? The entire culture of mourning fashion was a fascinating paradox. It was an outward sign of an inner state, a public display of a very private emotion. It was also a rigid, confining and sometimes suffocating set of rules that dictated not just what you wore, but how you lived for years after a loss. It was in many ways an extension of the Victorian ethos, a desire to impose order on a chaotic world, to give shape and form to the formless void of grief. And you thought picking an outfit in the morning was hard. The jet black crepe of the widow's veil has been shed, and the dark, sombre elegance of your outfit gives way to a new kind of accessory, one that is both beautiful and deeply, unsettlingly personal. We've touched on the idea of a locket with a lock of hair, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The Victorians, in their tireless quest to give grief a tangible form, took the morbid business of remembering loved ones to an art form. Your room now feels not just solemn, but intimate, almost sacred, filled with tiny, intricate creations made from human remains. The air around you seems to hum with a strange mix of craftsmanship and quiet reverence. You see a brooch on a dressing table, not of silver or gold, but a perfectly plaited braid of human hair. You pick it up, its texture soft yet firm, a miniature sculpture of a person's last physical presence. This wasn't just a quirky habit. It was a societal norm, a booming industry, and a deeply emotional way to hold on to a piece of those who were gone. The most mainstream historical fact about hair jewellery is its widespread popularity as a sentimental keepsake. Before the era of easily accessible photographs, a lock of hair was a common and powerful memento. It was a personal biological artifact that captured the essence of a person. By the Victorian era, this practice evolved from a simple lock in a locket to an entire cottage industry of skilled artisans known as hair workers. They would take locks of hair, often from deceased loved ones, and weave them into stunningly intricate pieces of jewellery and art. The craftsmanship was exquisite. You'd see brooches, bracelets, necklaces, and even earrings all made from tightly woven hair, often intertwined with gold threads or set with tiny pearls. The hair could be braided, curled, and twisted into patterns that mimicked lacework, flowers, or even delicate chains. It was a tangible, durable connection to the person, a way to literally wear their memory on your sleeve. The truly quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession, however, is the almost architectural scale of some of the creations. Hair wasn't just for jewellery. People created elaborate framed pictures, shadow boxes, and even wreaths out of human hair. You might see a framed picture with a weeping willow tree meticulously crafted from the hair of a deceased relative, or a bouquet of tiny flowers, each one made from the hair of a different family member. Some artists would even weave a whole scene, a quiet landscape or a pastoral image, out of a tapestry of different shades of hair. These weren't small, intimate objects. They were often large, Public displays meant to be hung in the parlour for all to see. They were a testament to the family's love, their artistic inclinations, and their willingness to embrace this morbid but sentimental art form. It's the kind of thing that today you might see on a very strange episode of a home renovation show. And here's the living room, where we've installed a beautiful wreath made of Aunt Mildred's hair. Just imagine the look on the contractor's face. The scholarly debate surrounding hair jewellery often centres on its psychological function. Historians still argue whether the practice of creating hair jewellery was a healthy coping mechanism or a way of delaying the grieving process. For many, it was a tactile link to the past, a way to keep a piece of the deceased physically close. In an era of high mortality, it was a way to feel some sense of control over the chaos of loss. The act of creating the jewellery itself, the painstaking weaving and intricate braiding, could have been a therapeutic, meditative process. It was a way to channel grief into a creative, productive act. But for others, the constant presence of a physical part of a deceased person could have been psychologically damaging. It might have made it difficult to accept the finality of death and move on. The jewellery, rather than being a comforting memory, could become a constant, suffocating reminder. The debate reflects a broader discussion about how we process grief, and whether the Victorians' open embrace of morbidity was a sign of emotional health or a symptom of deep-seated trauma. The sheer logistics of the hair jewellery business are also fascinating. Hair was, of course, a commodity. Hair from living people was collected and sold, often from young women who would sell their long locks for money. This hair would then be blended with the hair of a deceased loved one to create a cohesive piece. The practice was so widespread that there were mail-order catalogues where you could choose a design and send in the hair you wanted to be used. The ads in these catalogues often had solemn, almost poetic language about the sacredness of the work. It was a strange blend of mass production and deeply personal craftsmanship. You could order a bracelet for your recently departed great-aunt, and it would arrive a few weeks later, a perfect woven tribute to her life, made by a professional artisan you had never met. It was a business model based entirely on human sorrow. And it wasn't just for mourning. Hair jewellery was also a popular way to celebrate milestones, like a new marriage or a friendship. Lovers would exchange bracelets or rings woven from their own hair as a sign of their commitment. It was a way to cement a relationship in a tangible physical form. So, a hair necklace could signify a great loss, a deep friendship, or a fervent romance. You had to be very careful to know the context before you complimented someone on their new accessory. "Oh, that's a beautiful bracelet. Who did you get it from?" "My best friend. She's been dead for 6 months." Awkward. The hair itself was often a point of pride. Victorians valued long, healthy hair, and it was a sign of a person's vitality and beauty. To create a piece of hair jewellery was to take that life-affirming quality and transform it into a memorial. It was a way of preserving beauty in the face of decay. The whole practice is a perfect microcosm of the Victorian era, a combination of sentimentality, a fascination with the grotesque, and a relentless desire to create order and meaning out of a chaotic and often brutal world. So, as you look at that intricate woven brooch, you're no longer just seeing a piece of jewellery. You're seeing an entire world of ritual, grief, and a strange, quiet obsession with the past. You've carefully placed the hair-woven brooch back on the dressing table, the weight of a stranger's memory a little too heavy for your modern hands. The Victorian obsession with the physical body, both living and dead, wasn't just about art and fashion, it was also about health. Or, more accurately, the desperate pursuit of it in a world filled with disease and very few effective remedies. From the sentimental parlour, we're now moving to a cramped, overstuffed chemist's shop, where the air is thick with the scent of unidentifiable herbs, alcohol, and the lingering promise of a miracle cure. This is the world of medical quackery, a wild west of patent medicines, charismatic charlatans, and truly bizarre cures for every imaginable ailment. The Victorians were, in many ways, caught between two worlds. Scientific medicine was still in its infancy. The germ theory of disease was only just beginning to take hold, and doctors often did more harm than good with their reliance on bloodletting and leeches. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was creating a new, mobile, and increasingly educated middle class with disposable income, and they were desperate for a way to combat the constant threat of diseases like consumption, tuberculosis, cholera, and a whole host of other ailments. This created a perfect vacuum for the rise of the patent medicine industry. The most mainstream historical fact of this era is the sheer, unbridled popularity of patent medicines. These weren't medicines that had been patented in the modern sense of a government-approved formula. The names simply meant they were proprietary and owned by a specific person or company. The most famous of these were sold on a massive scale, with elaborate, often fraudulent advertising campaigns promising to cure virtually any disease. You'd see ads for things like Doctor, William's Pink Pills for Pale People, which promised to cure anemia, or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, a product for infants that was, alarmingly, a potent mixture of morphine and alcohol. These remedies were cheap, widely available, and required no prescription, which made them incredibly attractive to a public that was suspicious of doctors and often lived far from a qualified physician. The advertising was everywhere, from newspapers to the sides of barns, and it often preyed on people's anxieties about their health and their appearance. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this particular obsession is the absolutely wild and often dangerous ingredients used in these so-called cures. While Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup was lulling babies into a stupor with opium, other concoctions were even more sinister. Doctor, Scott's electric hairbrush, was a popular product that claimed to cure everything from headaches to baldness with mild electric shocks. Then there were remedies like Dr. Batty's cough syrup, which contained an astonishingly high concentration of alcohol and narcotics. People were, in effect, self-medicating with products that often contained opium, cocaine, mercury, and even arsenic. Many of these cures didn't cure anything at all, but their narcotic properties made people feel better temporarily, which was more than a lot of legitimate doctors could offer. They were a bit like a modern-day placebo effect, but with the added kick of a highly addictive substance. It's hard to imagine a society where you could just buy a bottle of morphine at the corner shop, but for the Victorians, it was a daily reality. The scholarly debate surrounding Victorian quackery often centres on the question of agency. Historians still argue whether the consumer was a gullible victim of relentless advertising, or an active participant in their own healthcare, making informed decisions based on the limited knowledge and options available to them. On one hand, the advertising was wildly deceptive and predatory, using testimonials and elaborate claims to sell products that were at best useless, and at worst, actively harmful. The sheer lack of regulation meant that anyone could put anything in a bottle, give it a fancy name, and sell it as a cure. On the other hand, the Victorians were not a monolithic block of dupes. They understood that these products were often a last resort, and many chose to use them precisely because they were accessible and offered a glimmer of hope. They were making a rational choice in an irrational world, opting for a cheap, immediate, and often intoxicating remedy over an expensive, painful, and often ineffective doctor's visit. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, a complex mix of hope, deception, and desperation. One of the more bizarre aspects of this obsession was the focus on specific, often morally charged ailments. Hysteria, a catch-all term for female nervousness, was a hugely popular diagnosis, and there were countless cures for it, from bizarre vibrating devices to special tonics. Similarly, a host of products were sold to combat nervous exhaustion and melancholia, which we would recognise today as depression. The Victorians saw these as physical ailments that could be treated with a potion or a pill, and the patent medicine industry was more than happy to provide. The fact that many of these cures were essentially just alcohol or opium probably contributed to a temporary feeling of well-being, reinforcing the belief that the product was working. The legacy of this era is a strange one. On the one hand, the widespread fraud and harm caused by patent medicines led directly to the formation of the first food and drug regulations in the early 20th century. So, you can thank the Victorians' love of quackery for the safety standards we have today. On the other hand, the culture of self-medication and a reliance on quick-fix remedies is something that has, in many ways, persisted. We still see products today that promise to cure everything from baldness to exhaustion, with little to no scientific evidence. The human desire for a simple solution to a complex problem is as old as time itself. The Victorians just had a much more dangerous way of indulging it. The next time you see a dubious-looking ad for a miracle health product, just remember that you're looking at a direct descendant of Dr. Scott's electric hairbrush. Having narrowly avoided a painful dose of mercury from a dubious patent medicine, you find yourself stumbling from the apothecary's den and into a much greener, quieter world. The air is no longer thick with the fumes of questionable tinctures, but with the cool, damp scent of rich soil and moist foliage. We are now entering the heart of what can only be described as one of the most unexpected and charmingly obsessive fads of the Victorian era. A feverish passion for collecting ferns, a phenomenon so widespread it earned its own name, pterodomania. It was a national mania, a social ritual, and an incredibly popular hobby that perfectly encapsulated the era's blend of science, domesticity, and social performance. Imagine, if you will, that your social calendar isn't filled with dinner parties and balls, but with fern forays. You and your friends, dressed in sturdy walking boots and long skirts, are tramping through damp woods and along rocky cliffs, a trowel in one hand and a collecting tin in the other. You're not searching for hidden treasure, but for a rare specimen of a particular fern species. The excitement of finding a new variety was, for the Victorians, the equivalent of discovering a new planet or a rare diamond. It was a wholesome outdoorsy pursuit that was deemed appropriate for everyone, from the humblest housewife to the most esteemed botanist. The most mainstream historical fact about pterodomania is its central role in both domestic life and scientific inquiry. Ferns were everywhere. They were on wallpaper, carved into furniture, printed on teacups, and woven into fabrics. The fern motif became as ubiquitous as the modern-day chevron or floral print. The obsession was fueled by a number of factors. First, the botanical world was rapidly expanding due to global exploration, and the public's appetite for new and exotic plants was insatiable. Second, ferns, unlike many other plants, don't have flowers, which made them a non-threatening, almost chaste subject for study, particularly appealing for women in a society that restricted their intellectual pursuits. And finally, the scientific study of ferns was still a relatively new field, and the lack of a formal academic structure meant that amateur enthusiasts could genuinely contribute to the body of knowledge. It was a unique opportunity for both men and women to participate in scientific discovery, a kind of citizen science for the 19th century. The truly quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the invention that made it all possible, the Wardian case. Before the Wardian case, transporting plants over long distances was incredibly difficult. The saline air on a sea voyage would kill most specimens, but in the 1830s, a doctor named Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward noticed that a fern and some soil he had accidentally enclosed in a sealed glass bottle thrived. He had created a self-contained miniature ecosystem. The Wardian case, essentially a portable terrarium, became the key to pterodomania. It allowed people to bring home delicate ferns from far-flung locations, and more importantly, it allowed them to cultivate them in the polluted, soot-filled air of urban Victorian homes. These glass boxes became a central feature of the Victorian parlour, a beautiful, living piece of art. They were a microcosm of the natural world, a little slice of the wild brought into the strict, orderly confines of the home. The cases themselves range from simple glass boxes to elaborate, ornate structures that looked like miniature greenhouses. They were a symbol of both your scientific curiosity and your domestic sophistication. A little living room terrarium was, in essence, the ultimate Instagram-worthy piece of home decor. The scholarly debate surrounding pterodomania is a fascinating one, particularly concerning its connection to gender roles. Historians still argue whether pterodomania was a tool of female empowerment or a way of reinforcing traditional domesticity. On one hand, it provided a socially acceptable outlet for women's intellectual curiosity. They could study and classify plants, go on collecting expeditions, and even publish botanical articles, all under the guise of a respectable hobby. It gave them a legitimate reason to get out of the house and engage with the world beyond their four walls. On the other hand, the hobby was often framed as a way to create a more beautiful and enriching home environment. The Wardian case was, by its very nature, an indoor pursuit. The language around the hobby in magazines and books often emphasised its feminine qualities and its suitability for the fair sex. It was a hobby that could be contained, both literally in the glass case and figuratively within the domestic sphere. The debate asks us to consider whether the Victorians were truly breaking down barriers or simply reframing traditional roles in a more palatable way. The obsession went far beyond the quiet cultivation of ferns in a glass case. It was a competitive, sometimes destructive pursuit. People would go to extreme lengths to find rare specimens, often venturing into dangerous terrain, and sadly, some of the most beautiful and rare species of ferns were hunted to the brink of extinction by zealous collectors. The fern's non-flowering nature meant that their reproductive parts, the sauri and sporangia, were a subject of intense microscopic study. It was a serious scientific endeavour for many, and the level of expertise among amateur collectors was often on par with that of professional botanists. It wasn't a casual hobby, it was a full-blown passion that could consume your life. The world of pterodomania was a strange blend of quiet domesticity and wild, adventurous obsession. It was a hobby that allowed you to connect with nature without ever leaving your parlour, and yet it also inspired people to scale mountainsides and trudge through bogs in pursuit of a rare botanical prize. It was, in its own way, a reflection of the Victorian soul, a desire to impose order on the chaos of nature, to bring the exotic and the wild into the comfort of the home, and to find a scientific, rational reason for a very irrational, emotional obsession. And if you happen to find a new species and name it after yourself, well, that was just an added bonus. The quiet, verdant calm of the terrarium has lulled you into a sense of safety, but don't get too comfortable. That neatly contained, living piece of nature was just a stepping stone to a far more ghoulish and expansive obsession. From the delicate beauty of a cultivated fern, we now move to the macabre artistry of taxidermy, the chilling spectacle of exotic specimens, and the relentless, often brutal, pursuit of trophies from around the globe. Your room now feels less like a quiet sanctuary and more like a dusty, oversized cabinet of curiosities, filled with the glassy eyes of long-dead animals, the skeletal remains of strange creatures, and the quiet, unsettling presence of things that were never meant to be indoors. The Victorian era, with its insatiable curiosity and its ever-expanding empire, was a time of collection. But this wasn't just about stamps or teacups. It was a time when the entire natural world became a commodity, a vast and wild collection waiting to be catalogued, categorised, and ultimately displayed in the home. It was a way for the average person to feel connected to the far-flung corners of the world that were being explored by heroic and often ruthless adventurers. You, as a Victorian, could not travel to Africa, but you could, with a bit of money, have a stuffed lion in your study, a silent, static symbol of your connection to a grand, global project. The most mainstream historical fact of this obsession is the rise of taxidermy as a popular art form and a domestic hobby. While taxidermy had existed for centuries, the Victorians refined it into an obsession. It was a way to preserve a beloved pet or to display a rare or exotic creature as a conversation piece. A stuffed bird in a glass case, a deer's head mounted on the wall, or a full-size grizzly bear standing silently in a grand hallway were all common sights in the homes of the wealthy. The craft was perfected to the point of being a true art, with skilled taxidermists able to pose animals in lifelike and sometimes even absurd dioramas. You'd see scenes of squirrels boxing, kittens having a tea party, or rabbits playing instruments. This was a direct result of the increasing availability of exotic animals, either through hunting or the flourishing global trade. The taxidermist was the final stage in the journey from a foreign land to a Victorian parlour. The truly quirky or fringe tidbit of this particular obsession is the use of taxidermy for anthropomorphic tableau, or what we might call taxidermy with a sense of humour. A particularly well-known artist, Walter Potter, made a career out of creating elaborate, sometimes unsettling dioramas featuring animals dressed in human clothes and posed in human situations. He created scenes like The House That Jack Built, featuring dozens of rats acting out the nursery rhyme, and The Kitten's Wedding, where a group of kittens were dressed in tiny wedding attire. To us it seems bizarre and a little grotesque, but for the Victorians it was a perfectly acceptable form of light-hearted amusement and a clever way to show off a taxidermist's skill. It was a strange mix of morbid fascination and whimsical fantasy. It's hard to imagine anyone finding a tiny stuffed kitten in a bridal dress cute, but they certainly did. The scholarly debate surrounding the Victorian appetite for exotica centres on the intersection of science and colonialism. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with collecting exotic specimens was a noble pursuit of scientific knowledge or a destructive act of imperial domination. On one hand, the collectors, from professional naturalists to amateur enthusiasts, contributed immeasurably to our understanding of the world's biodiversity. Their collections filled museums and provided the raw data for new theories about evolution and species classification. They were, in their own minds, bringing order to the wild chaos of nature. On the other hand, the pursuit was often brutal, unsustainable, and inextricably linked to the violent expansion of the British Empire. The animals were hunted and killed, often in staggering numbers, with little regard for the local ecosystems. The specimens were then taken from their native lands and displayed as trophies, symbols of a colonial power that was both dominant and enlightened. The debate asks us to consider whether the scientific gain outweighed the ethical cost, and whether the line between curiosity and conquest was, for the Victorians, blurred to the point of being invisible. Beyond taxidermy, the Victorians' ghoulish appetite for exotica extended to the human world. Private collectors amassed vast cabinets of curiosities that contained not just preserved animals, but also human skulls, shrunken heads, and the mummified remains of people from other cultures. It was a way of collecting the exotic other, of reducing a complex human culture to a single static object of study. This was often done under the guise of scientific inquiry. The field of craniology, which we'll get into later, was a prime example, but it was also a way to demonstrate power and superiority. The craze wasn't just about display, it was also about ownership. Having a rare specimen was a status symbol, and the more dangerous and exotic the animal, the higher the prestige. A trophy from a lion hunt or a tiger hunt was a sign of your bravery and your virility, a physical testament to your place at the top of the food chain. The public flocked to museums and exhibitions that displayed these specimens, eager to catch a glimpse of a creature they would never see in the wild. The specimens were often arranged in dramatic theatrical poses, as if caught in a moment of violent struggle. It was a way of making nature into a spectacle, a form of entertainment that was both educational and thrilling. The legacy of this obsession is all around us. The great natural history museums of the world, like London's Natural History Museum, are filled with specimens collected during the Victorian era. The silent, glass-eyed creatures in those halls are a physical record of a time when curiosity knew no bounds, and ethical considerations were, for the most part, an afterthought. It was a period of staggering discovery and equally staggering destruction, and as you look at that stuffed squirrel, frozen forever in the act of playing a tiny violin, you're left to wonder if the price of knowledge was worth the stillness. The unsettling stillness of the stuffed menagerie gives way to a new kind of spectacle, one that is both profoundly disturbing and fiercely popular. From the silent, glassy-eyed animals of the taxidermist's studio, we move to a different kind of curiosity, one of living, breathing human beings. The Victorian obsession with the exotic, the strange, and the morbid extended beyond the animal kingdom and into a deeply problematic form of entertainment, the freak show. Your room now feels less like a quiet study and more like a bustling, chaotic carnival tent. The air thick with the scent of sawdust, cheap cigars, and the nervous energy of the crowd. For the Victorians, the freak show was a mainstream form of popular entertainment, a blend of carnival sideshow and human zoo. It was a place where people with physical deformities, rare medical conditions, or simply unusual appearances were put on display for public consumption. The audiences, from the lowest rungs of society to the highest, flocked to these shows, drawn by a potent mix of fascination, fear, and a morbid curiosity about the limits of the human body. It was a cultural phenomenon that reflected and reinforced many of the era's anxieties about science, morality, and what it meant to be normal. The most mainstream historical fact of the freak show is its commercial success and its central figures. The biggest name in the business was undoubtedly P.T. Barnum, a master showman who understood the power of spectacle and hyperbole. He presented his freaks not as objects of pity, but as a source of wonder and profit. He had stars like Charles Stratton, better known as Tom Thumb, who was presented as a general and a miniature man of great talent, and the Siamese twins Chang and Eng Bunker, who were billed as a scientific marvel. Barnum and other showmen carefully constructed backstories and elaborate personas for their performers, blurring the line between fact and fiction, and creating a narrative that made them seem more alien and extraordinary. It was a business built on both the physical reality of the performers and the psychological manipulation of the audience. It was the original reality TV show, but with far less a sense of privacy. The quirky or fringe tidbit of the freak show is the remarkable agency and entrepreneurial spirit of some of the performers. While many were exploited, others became incredibly wealthy and famous in their own right. They were often the highest paid members of the shows they performed in. Tom Thumb, for example, was a savvy businessman who performed for royalty and became an international celebrity. He owned multiple homes and had a substantial fortune. Chang and Eng Bunker toured the world, eventually retired to North Carolina, became wealthy plantation owners, and married sisters. Their lives were a testament to the fact that while they were exploited by the system, they also learned how to exploit it in return. They used their celebrity to gain a level of financial independence and social standing that would have been otherwise impossible in a rigid, class-based society. They were more than just the objects of a morbid gaze. They were entrepreneurs in their own right. It's a very strange and a little inspiring thought, isn't it? The scholarly debate surrounding freak shows is a particularly difficult one. Historians still argue whether freak shows were a form of entertainment that objectified and exploited people, or if they were a unique space where individuals who didn't conform to societal norms could find a community and a livelihood. On one hand, the shows were undeniably dehumanizing. Performers were often given degrading stage names, and their bodies were presented as scientific curiosities or monstrous aberrations. The public's gaze was often cruel and unfeeling, a relentless spectacle of othering. On the other hand, for many of the performers, the freak show offered a better life than they would have had otherwise. A person with a severe physical deformity in Victorian society might have been relegated to an asylum or a life of poverty, but the freak show offered a career, fame, and a community of people who understood their unique challenges. It was a place where their difference, which would have been a source of shame elsewhere, became a source of strength and profit. The debate asks us to confront the uncomfortable reality that exploitation and empowerment were not mutually exclusive in this peculiar corner of Victorian entertainment. The popular appeal of the freak show was also deeply tied to the era's burgeoning scientific understanding of the human body. As we move into the next section on phrenology and criminology, you'll see how the Victorians were obsessed with cataloguing and categorising every aspect of the human form, both normal and abnormal. The freak show was a living, breathing laboratory for this kind of pseudo-scientific inquiry. People would go to see the wild man of Borneo or the bearded lady, not just for a cheap thrill, but also to satisfy a kind of anthropological curiosity. They were looking for evidence of the other, for something that would help them define themselves as normal. The freaks served as a kind of moral mirror, a way for the audience to confirm their own physical and social standing. The legacy of the freak show is a complex and dark one. It has shaped our modern ideas about disability, difference, and the nature of public entertainment. The line between entertainment and exploitation is one we still struggle with today, whether it's in reality television or in the relentless public gaze on celebrity. The freak shows of the Victorian era were a product of their time, but they also laid the groundwork for a culture that is still deeply fascinated by the unusual and the grotesque. So, as the last performer bows and the tent empties, you're left with the unsettling thought that our modern sensibilities may not be so far from theirs after all. The show, in a way, never truly ended. The curious gaze of the crowd has dissipated and the sawdust of the carnival tent has settled. You are now in a new space, one that is hushed, academic, and filled with the silent, unsettling presence of human remains. From the public spectacle of the freak show, we transition to a more clinical but no less morbid obsession. The Victorian fascination with the human skull and face as a window into a person's character, intelligence, and moral fibre. This was a world of calipers, head-measuring devices, and the chilling belief that a bump on your head could reveal your destiny. The Victorians, with their boundless faith in progress and science, were desperate to impose order on a chaotic world. They believed that everything could be measured, categorised, and understood, from the ferns in a terrarium to the social standing of a widow. This impulse to classify extended to humanity itself. They were particularly concerned with the problem of crime and deviance. Why did some people turn to a life of crime? Was it a moral failing, or was it something they were born with? This question led to a fringe and pseudo-scientific movement that perfectly captured the era's blend of scientific ambition and racial prejudice. The most mainstream historical fact of this obsession is the rise of phrenology. Phrenology was a now discredited pseudoscience that claimed to determine a person's character, personality, and intelligence by measuring the bumps and contours of their skull. Developed by German physician Franz Joseph Gall in the late 18th century, it was perfected and popularized by his student Johann Spurzheim, and quickly became a global sensation. Phrenologists believed that the brain was composed of dozens of separate organs, each responsible for a different faculty, like amativeness, love, cautiousness, or veneration. The size of these organs, they argued, was reflected in the shape of the skull, and a larger bump meant a more developed faculty. People would pay good money to have their heads read by a professional phrenologist. It was a kind of proto-psychology, a way of understanding oneself and one's potential through a seemingly scientific process. It was a lot like a modern-day personality quiz, but with the added bonus of someone getting to feel your head. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is its deep entanglement with the study of criminality and the belief in the born criminal. An Italian physician named Cesare Lombroso took the ideas of phrenology and elevated them to a new, more sinister level. He studied the physical characteristics of thousands of prisoners and came to the conclusion that criminals were a separate, degenerate species of humanity, an evolutionary throwback. He believed that certain physical traits, such as a sloping forehead, asymmetrical facial features, a large jaw or a small skull, were markers of a criminal nature. He would use calipers and tape measures to meticulously record these features, and his work, though scientifically baseless, was incredibly influential. It was a chilling idea that a person's moral character could be determined by their physical appearance. It provided a convenient scientific justification for social prejudices, and was used to reinforce stereotypes about the poor and people of colour. The legacy of this belief system is the countless police mugshots and criminal profiles that still to this day focus on a person's physical appearance. The scholarly debate surrounding the Victorian fascination with criminology is particularly poignant. Historians still argue whether this pseudoscience was a genuine attempt to understand human behaviour, or a moralistic tool used to justify social control and prejudice. On one hand, you can see it as a product of its time, a fledgling attempt to apply the scientific method to a complex social problem. The Victorians genuinely wanted to know why people committed crimes, and they were working with the best and often limited tools they had. They were trying to create a rational, systematic way of preventing crime. On the other hand, the outcomes of this research were overwhelmingly racist and classist. The scientific findings of Lombroso and others were used to reinforce the idea that poverty was a sign of moral degeneracy, and that non-European races were inherently inferior. The scientific language provided a respectable cover for what was, at its core, a form of social engineering. The debate forces us to confront the fact that even seemingly objective scientific pursuits can be shaped by the prejudices of the people who conduct them. This obsession with the physical body as a map to a person's soul wasn't limited to the criminal underworld. Phrenology was also used as a tool for self-improvement and matchmaking. A young woman might go to a phrenologist to see if she had the organ for domesticity, while a young man might be told that he had a head perfect for business. It was also used to determine a person's suitability for a marriage partner. A well-matched couple would have complementary bumps on their heads, ensuring a harmonious union. It was a kind of social engineering tool disguised as a scientific parlour game. It's a funny thought, isn't it? Sorry, darling, but your amativeness is far too small for me to consider a life together. The public's appetite for this kind of information was insatiable. Books on phrenology were bestsellers, and you could buy busts with the different cranial regions labelled a perfect decoration for a scientifically minded study. These busts were a way of publicly displaying your intellectual curiosity and your belief in the power of the new science. The public's fascination with criminals and their bodies also led to the collection of human skulls, especially those of notorious murderers. These skulls were kept in private collections or donated to museums, where they were meticulously measured and studied in the hopes of finding a common criminal trait. It was a macabre hobby, a grim extension of the collector's mania we've already discussed. The Victorian fascination with phrenology and criminology was a product of a society grappling with rapid change. The old certainties of class and morality were being challenged, and the new sciences seemed to offer a way to restore order. The idea that you could read a person's character from the shape of their skull was, in a strange way, comforting. It provided a simple answer to a complex question. It was, of course, a complete fiction. But for the Victorians, it was a beautiful, elegant lie that helped them make sense of a world they were struggling to understand. The calipers and tape measures of the phrenologist have been put away, and the silent, judging busts of criminal heads are now just a memory. From the sterile, unsettling world of pseudoscience, we now move to a much more personal and often tragic obsession, one that was far more widespread and less talked about in polite society. The air in your room feels heavy and sweet. a cloying scent of burning incense and exotic flowers. You're now in a world of quiet rooms, half-closed eyes, and the dangerously alluring promise of escape. This is the Victorian fascination with opium. For the Victorians, opium was not just an illegal drug to be feared, it was a common and readily available substance, a staple in medicine cabinets, and a source of both recreational pleasure and profound addiction. This was before the widespread understanding of narcotics and their addictive properties. Opium, in its various forms, was seen as a panacea, a cure for everything from a bad cough to a broken heart. The ubiquity of the drug was a result of a lack of regulation, and a culture that was, in many ways, desperate for a way to manage pain and emotional distress. The most mainstream historical fact about this era is the widespread and casual use of laudanum. Laudanum was a tincture of opium, often mixed with alcohol. It was sold in chemist shops and grocery stores without a prescription, and it was ridiculously cheap. You could buy a bottle for less than the price of a loaf of bread. It was used by everyone, from factory workers to wealthy ladies, to treat a variety of ailments, including headaches, insomnia, and nervous disorders. A tired mother might give her crying baby a dose of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which, as we discussed, was full of opium to get a few hours of quiet. A man suffering from a toothache might take a dose to dull the pain. The drug was so common that it was the active ingredient in a vast number of patent medicines. It was a domestic staple, and people were using it with little to no knowledge of its highly addictive nature. It was like taking a modern-day aspirin, but that aspirin had the potential to ruin your life. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the cultural and literary fascination with the drug. Opium was not just a medical remedy, it was a muse for artists and a symbol of bohemian life. Writers and poets romanticised the drug, writing about its hallucinatory effects and the vivid, fantastical dreams it could produce. The most famous example is Thomas de Quincey's 1821 memoir, Confessions of an English Opium Eater. The book was a sensation, detailing de Quincey's descent into addiction and his subsequent visions and nightmares. He described the drug as a powerful agent of imagination and a source of a kind of intellectual pleasure that was unrivalled. His writing, and that of others, created a mystique around opium, making it seem like a sophisticated intellectual pursuit rather than a dangerous habit. Opium dens, where people could go to smoke the drug, became a symbol of the seedy, exotic underbelly of society, a place for forbidden pleasure and dangerous encounters. The dens were often associated with Chinatowns, and were a source of both morbid fascination and moral panic. The scholarly debate about Victorian opium use is a complex one. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of opium was a symptom of societal malaise or a rational response to the lack of effective medical alternatives. On one hand, you can see the widespread addiction as a sign of a deeply unhappy society, one that was struggling with the harsh realities of industrial life, poverty, and disease. The drug offered a cheap and accessible escape, a way to numb the pain of a brutal existence. On the other hand, the Victorians were living in a world without modern painkillers or effective treatments for chronic illness. Opium was, for many, the only thing that worked. A person with a painful chronic illness would have had no other recourse. The debate asks us to consider whether we can judge their choices by our modern standards of health and medicine. For them, it was a choice between living with unbearable pain or risking addiction. It was, in a way, a perfectly rational choice in an irrational world. The Victorian medical community's attitude towards opium was also a strange paradox. While doctors were often the first to prescribe the drug, they were also the ones who began to realise its addictive nature and its long-term effects. By the end of the century, there was a growing movement to regulate and restrict the sale of narcotics. But for decades, doctors and pharmacists were more than happy to sell it, often without warning their patients of the risks. The social stigma of addiction was growing, but the drug itself remained an open secret, a quiet addiction that was present in homes across the country. The effects of this quiet addiction were devastating. Families were torn apart, lives were ruined, and a generation of people lived in a constant state of chemical dependency. The very same substance that could provide a few hours of relief from a cough could also trap you in a lifelong cycle of suffering. The Victorians, in their relentless pursuit of progress and their desire to conquer all of nature's ills, had stumbled upon a new and powerful foe, and they didn't even realise it until it was too late. So as you leave this dimly lit room, with the sweet, sickly scent of opium lingering in the air, you are left with the uneasy feeling that a quiet tragedy was unfolding in homes everywhere, hidden behind a veil of respectability and misplaced trust. The Victorian love for a quick fix had led them down a dangerous and often fatal path. The sweet, hallucinatory haze of the opium den has cleared, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of a newly turned grave. From the quiet tragedy of addiction, we now descend into a darker, more gruesome obsession. The morbid reality of body snatching. The Victorians were obsessed with the physical body, and this obsession wasn't limited to the living. It also extended to the newly deceased, leading to a period of public panic, grave robbing, and a clandestine industry that thrived on a grisly demand. Imagine, if you will, the palpable terror that would grip you as a Victorian as you laid a loved one to rest. The funeral would be a sombre affair. The mourning clothes, the horse-drawn hearse, the final lowering of the casket into the cold earth. But the ceremony wasn't the end of your duty. You and your family might then spend the next several nights sitting in shifts, armed with shotguns and lanterns, guarding the fresh grave. This was a grim necessity, born out of a desperate fear that the body of your loved one would be stolen in the night. The thought of their remains being unearthed, not for a resurrection, but for a dissection table, was a source of profound horror. The most mainstream historical fact of this era is the business of grave robbing, or as the practitioners were grimly called, resurrection men. This was a direct result of a fundamental imbalance in Victorian society, a booming medical industry with an insatiable need for cadavers and a legal system that made it nearly impossible to obtain them. In a time when anatomy was a crucial part of medical education, the only bodies legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals. This was a paltry supply, and it simply could not meet the demands of the hundreds of medical schools and thousands of students. This created a lucrative, albeit macabre, market. Resurrection men, like the infamous Burke and Hare in Edinburgh, would exhume newly buried bodies and sell them to anatomy professors for a significant profit. A single body could fetch a price equivalent to several months' wages for a labourer. The business was so profitable that it attracted a vicious and ruthless element. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the proliferation of anti-body snatching devices and practices. The public, in a state of utter terror, fought back against the grave robbers with inventive and often bizarre countermeasures. You could purchase mort safes, which were heavy iron cages or stone slabs placed over the grave to protect the casket. Some families chose to bury their loved ones in a kind of iron framework that made digging nearly impossible. There were also coffin torps, a kind of spring-loaded booby trap that would fire a blank cartridge if anyone tried to lift the coffin. Families would also hire professional watchmen to guard the graves, or even build a small fortified hut in the cemetery where they could stand watch. The entire industry of death from the burial to the tombstone was influenced by the fear of desecration. You can almost see a Victorian entrepreneur looking at a newly dug grave and thinking, how can I sell a security system for that? The scholarly debate surrounding body snatching often centres on the ethical dilemma it presented. Historians still argue whether the medical community's reliance on body snatchers was a necessary evil for the advancement of science or a morally indefensible practice. On one hand, the study of anatomy was absolutely essential for medical progress. Without a supply of cadavers, doctors and surgeons could not learn how to operate, and the field would have stagnated. Many of the most brilliant medical minds of the era, while privately deploring the practice, would have acknowledged that it was the only way they could get the bodies they needed. It was a dark secret that everyone in the medical community knew about but was unwilling to stop. On the other hand, the practice was a profound violation of human dignity and a source of immense terror and grief for the public. It preyed on the poor, who could not afford the elaborate protections for their graves, and it turned the dead into a commodity. The debate forces us to consider whether the ends can ever justify the means, and whether the pursuit of knowledge, no matter how noble, can ever be worth the profound human cost. The grisly trade came to a head with the infamous case of Burke and Hare in 1828. They took the practice a step further, not just digging up bodies, but actually murdering at least 16 people to sell their remains. Their trial and subsequent execution, Burke was publicly hanged, and his body was fittingly dissected, brought the horrors of the trade into the public consciousness like never before. The outrage was so great that it finally led to a change in the law. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was a landmark piece of legislation that, for the first time, allowed medical schools to legally acquire unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals. This effectively put the body snatchers out of business and brought the grim era of grave robbing to an end. It was a direct consequence of a horrifying event. The Victorians' obsession with body snatching reveals a deep-seated paradox. They were a society that was so deeply invested in the sacredness of the burial ritual, in providing a final resting place for the dead, and yet they allowed a system to flourish that treated the dead as a resource to be harvested. It was a clash between religious piety and scientific necessity, and for decades the latter won out. The next time you find yourself walking through an old Victorian-era cemetery, take a moment to look at the elaborate fences and heavy slabs on the graves. They are not just decorations, they are a silent, haunting reminder of a time when the dead were not always allowed to rest in peace. The mortsafe, a grim iron cage over the grave, is a chilling reminder of a fear that has, for the most part, faded. But the impulse behind body snatching, the morbid curiosity about the human body, did not disappear with the passage of the Anatomy Act. From the clandestine work of the Resurrection Men, we now move into the bright dissecting room, a place of serious scientific inquiry and, for the public, a source of theatrical and often gruesome entertainment. Your room now feels cold and sterile, the air filled not with the scent of lilies or incense, but with the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic and formaldehyde. You are standing in the heart of the Victorian obsession with the art of anatomy. For the Victorians, the human body was a subject of endless fascination. It was a complex machine, a biological marvel, and a vessel for the soul. They were a society that had, by necessity, a very hands-on relationship with death and disease, and this familiarity bred a deep and unblinking curiosity about what lay beneath the skin. This impulse, combined with a newfound respect for science, led to a public appetite for anatomical knowledge that went far beyond the needs of medical students. It was an intellectual pursuit, a macabre hobby, and a source of public spectacle. The most mainstream historical fact of this obsession is the public's access to anatomical lectures and dissections. While private dissections in medical schools were common, the Victorians also held public demonstrations, often at universities or lecture halls, that were open to a paying audience. These events were a source of both education and macabre entertainment. A charismatic anatomist would stand over a cadaver, using sharp tools to expose muscles, organs and bones, all while a captivated audience watched. It was a bit like a modern-day surgical drama, but with a live, unscripted performance. The public flocked to these lectures, eager to see the inner workings of a human being. It was a way for them to demystify the body, to see what was causing the epidemics and the diseases that plagued their lives. It was also, let's be honest, a good old-fashioned gross-out. A kind of morbid thrill that you just couldn't get from a Punch and Judy show. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the proliferation of anatomical models and wax figures. For those who couldn't attend a public dissection, or for those who wanted to study the human body in the privacy of their own home, there was a booming market for anatomical models. These were not the cheap plastic skeletons you see today. They were incredibly detailed and often disturbingly realistic, models made from wax, plaster or papier-mâché. The most famous of these were the wax models created by artists and anatomists in Italy and France, which were so lifelike they were often referred to as veiled allegories of the human form. These models showed everything from the intricate network of the nervous system to the full dissection of a human head. They were a perfect blend of science and art, and they were used in both medical schools and in public exhibitions. The models range from full-size, lifelike human figures with removable organs to smaller, more portable versions that were used by students. Some of the most unsettling models were those of diseased body parts or those that depicted the stages of death. The Victorians, in their relentless pursuit of knowledge, did not shy away from the grotesque. They embraced it, and they put it on display. The scholarly debate surrounding the public's fascination with anatomy often centres on its moral and religious implications. Historians still argue whether the public's obsession with anatomy was a sign of a new, secular faith in science or a form of morbid curiosity that was a violation of human dignity. On one hand, the study of anatomy was a legitimate scientific pursuit, a cornerstone of modern medicine. The Victorians saw it as a way to conquer disease, to live longer, and to understand the elegant design of the human body. It was a form of intellectual and moral progress. On the other hand, The public dissections and the public display of human remains were a profound violation of the sanctity of the body. In a deeply religious society, the body was seen as a temple, a vessel for the soul, and the act of cutting it open and putting it on display was for many deeply sacrilegious. The debate asks us to consider whether the Victorian scientific curiosity was, in its own way, a form of intellectual transgression, a rebellion against old religious certainties. The morbid appeal of anatomy was not just about intellectual curiosity, it was also about the grotesque. The Victorians were a society that was often emotionally repressed and socially constrained. The public spectacle of a dissection offered a kind of release, a chance to witness something that was raw, real, and profoundly unsettling. It was a form of catharsis, a way to confront the reality of death and decay in a controlled environment. The anatomist was a kind of high priest, revealing the secrets of the human machine to a rapt audience. This public fascination with the human body also had a direct influence on the art world. Artists began to study anatomy with a renewed intensity, and the human figure was rendered with a new kind of scientific accuracy. The macabre reality of the dissecting room made its way into paintings, drawings, and sculptures. The Victorians, in their relentless quest to understand and categorize, had turned the human body into a work of art, and they were not afraid to get their hands dirty. The legacy of this obsession is the world we live in today, where the human body is a subject of constant medical and scientific inquiry. We have medical textbooks, advanced imaging, and anatomical models that are far more accurate than anything the Victorians could have dreamed of. But for all our technology, we still have a deep, if often unacknowledged, fascination with the inner workings of the human body. The Victorians, in their own gruesome way, were just getting a head start. The next time you see a medical diagram or a TV show about surgery, remember the cold lecture halls and the wax models of the 19th century. The foundation of modern medicine was built on a very morbid kind of curiosity. The cold, clinical atmosphere of the anatomy lecture hall is fading, replaced by the suffocating intimacy of a Victorian boudoir. The air is no longer filled with the scent of antiseptic, but with the cloying sweetness of perfume and the metallic tang of steel boning. From the gruesome study of the inner body, we now turn to a far more commonplace, and in its own way, painful, obsession, the relentless pursuit of the ideal silhouette through tight lacing. This was a daily ritual, a fashion statement, and a physical act of self-torture that perfectly encapsulated the Victorian obsession with control, order, and the relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal. For the Victorians, the body was not a natural form to be celebrated, but a canvas to be shaped, a raw material to be moulded and refined. The corset was the primary tool for this artistic endeavour. It was not just a piece of underwear, it was a foundational garment that dictated a woman's posture, movement, and social standing. The ideal silhouette, a small waist and a dramatic hourglass figure, was a symbol of femininity, respectability, and leisure. A woman who could afford to be tightly laced was a woman who didn't have to engage in manual labour, a clear sign of her high social status. The most mainstream historical fact of this era is the ubiquity and the social significance of the corset. From a young age, girls were laced into corsets to mould their bodies and train them to stand and move with a particular posture. The corset was a requirement for almost all women, regardless of class, with only the poorest women being exempted. The corset was also a rite of passage. A young woman's first corset was a symbol of her transition from childhood into adulthood. It was a physical and symbolic act of confinement, a literal embodiment of the restrictive social norms that governed her life. The corset was also a marvel of engineering. They were often made with steel or whalebone boning, and they were designed to be pulled as tight as possible, often by a maid, and sometimes with the use of a special pulley system. The smaller the waist, the more beautiful and fashionable the woman was considered. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the extreme practice of tight lacing, or waist training, as it would be called today. While most women wore corsets that were snug but manageable, a dedicated minority took the practice to an extreme, cinching their waists to an astonishingly small circumference. There are accounts of women with waists as small as 13 or 14 inches, a size that seems physically impossible to us today. This was not a quick process. It required years of gradually tightening the laces, and it was a source of great pride and social envy. These extreme tight laces were often the subject of public fascination, and they were both admired for their dedication and pitied for their self-inflicted pain. They were the original influencers, with their bodies as their primary canvas. The scholarly debate surrounding the corset and tight lacing is a fierce one. Historians still argue whether the corset was a symbol of female oppression or a means of female empowerment, and a choice made by women themselves. On one hand, the corset was undeniably a tool of control. It physically restricted a woman's movement, made it difficult for her to breathe deeply, and often caused serious health problems, including displaced organs and respiratory issues. It was an expectation placed upon women by a patriarchal society that demanded they conform to a specific and often unnatural ideal of beauty. On the other hand, many women passionately defended the corset. They saw it as a garment that gave them a sense of control and confidence. It improved their posture, supported their backs, and made them feel elegant and poised. For some women, it was a way of embracing a fashionable trend, a kind of rebellious act in a world where so many other things were out of their control. The debate asks us to consider whether a choice made within a system of oppression can ever truly be considered a free one. The health consequences of tight lacing were, of course, a source of great concern and medical fascination. Doctors wrote countless articles and books decrying the practice, showing diagrams of squashed organs and deformed ribs. The Victorians, in their strange paradoxical way, were obsessed with both the morbid consequences of the corset and the aesthetic beauty it produced. It was a classic case of beauty before health. You could find medical articles detailing the dangers of the practice in the same magazines that were filled with advertisements for the very same corsets. It was a social contradiction that was played out on the bodies of millions of women. The corset was also a symbol of moral rectitude. An uncorseted woman was seen as loose and unrespectable. The garment was a kind of physical chastity belt, a way of reinforcing the idea that a woman's body was not her own, but something to be contained and controlled for the benefit of society. It was a garment that policed her body, her movement, and her social standing. As you look at that old, rigid and beautiful corset, you're left to wonder what it was all for. Was it for the man in her life, or for the other women who would judge her appearance? Was it a conscious choice or a learned necessity? The legacy of the Victorian corset is a complex one, a tangle of oppression and empowerment, beauty and pain. It is a stark reminder that what we consider beautiful is often a reflection of what we consider to be morally good, and that the relentless pursuit of an ideal can have a very real and often painful cost. The corset was a physical manifestation of a society that demanded perfection, and the women who wore them were, in their own way, walking works of art and walking martyrs. The painful, constricted world of the tightly laced corset fades as you take a deep, unfettered breath. From the self-inflicted physical constraints of fashion, we now move to the psychological and social constraints of a much more terrifying institution, the Victorian asylum. The air in your room now feels clinical and cold, filled with a ghostly quiet that is more chilling than any sound. You're now standing at the gates of a massive, imposing brick building, a place where people who were deemed mad were sent to be contained, and sometimes to be cured. For the Victorians, mental illness was a source of both profound fear and morbid curiosity. The line between eccentricity and outright insanity was often blurred, and a host of ailments, from nervous exhaustion to female hysteria, a favourite catch-all diagnosis, as we've already discussed, were deemed worthy of institutionalisation. The asylum was the ultimate form of social control, a place where those who didn't conform to the rigid norms of Victorian society could be hidden away. The most mainstream historical fact of this obsession is the rise of the asylum boom in the 19th century. Driven by a newfound belief that mental illness could be treated, massive purpose-built institutions were constructed across the country. This was a shift away from the brutal, unregulated private madhouses of the past. The new asylums were often built in idyllic rural settings, designed to be therapeutic retreats where patients could be cured through a combination of fresh air, good food, and a strict, orderly routine. They were presented as places of compassion and healing, a far cry from the chaotic and often dangerous madhouses. They were, in a way, a physical manifestation of the Victorian desire to impose order on a perceived chaos, to bring rationality to the human mind. The asylum was meant to be a kind of moral machine, a place where a disordered mind could be set right. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the bizarre and often cruel treatments that were used within these compassionate institutions. The belief that mental illness was a physical ailment led to a host of strange and often barbaric remedies. Patients might be spun on a tranquilizer chair until they were dizzy and compliant, or they might be plunged into a cold bath, a practice known as hydrotherapy, which was believed to shock the system into sanity. Some doctors experimented with early forms of electrotherapy, believing that a mild electric shock could stimulate a dormant mind. Then there were the rest cures, where a patient, usually a woman diagnosed with hysteria, would be confined to bed for weeks on end, forbidden from reading, writing, or even talking, in the belief that mental and physical rest would cure her. It all seems deeply counterintuitive to us, but for the Victorians it was a logical extension of their belief that the body and mind were inextricably linked, and that you could cure one by treating the other. The scholarly debate surrounding Victorian asylums is a profound one. Historians still argue whether the asylum was a genuine attempt to treat the mentally ill, or a convenient way to confine and control those who were deemed a social inconvenience. On one hand, there were genuinely well-intentioned doctors and reformers who believed in the power of moral treatment, a non-restraint approach that relied on kindness and a calm environment. These doctors sought to treat the patient, not just confine them. On the other hand, the asylums were often filled with people who weren't mad in the way we'd define it today. They were unmarried women who had become pregnant, men who were struggling with addiction, or simply people who were a burden on their families and society. The asylum provided a convenient, socially acceptable way to get rid of them. The sheer number of people institutionalized in the late 19th century, the asylum boom, suggests that it was about more than just a medical need. It was about social control. The debate asks us to consider whether the good intentions of a few can ever outweigh the systemic failings of an entire institution. The allure of the asylum for the public was a complex one. For some, it was a source of fascination. Stories of the lunatics and their bizarre behaviour were a staple of popular press, and some asylums even held public tours for paying customers. It was a kind of human zoo, a place where the normal could look at the abnormal and feel a sense of moral and intellectual superiority. It was a way to confirm their own sanity and their place in a strictly ordered world. For others, the asylum was a place of profound dread. It was the ultimate threat, a place where you could lose your identity, your freedom, and your sanity, all at once. The fear of being wrongly institutionalized was a common theme in Victorian literature and a very real anxiety for people who lived on the margins of society. The legacy of the Victorian asylum is all around us. The massive, beautiful buildings still stand, many of them repurposed into universities or private homes. But the legacy of their approach to mental health, with its focus on confinement and control, has left a lasting impact on our own mental health care systems. The Victorians were the first society to truly grapple with mental illness on a large scale, and in their own way they were trying to do what they thought was right. But their journey was a painful and flawed one, a stark reminder that good intentions can often be a breeding ground for institutional cruelty. The asylum was a mirror of the society that created it, a place of order and control that hid a deep-seated fear of the unknown and the unconventional. As you leave the silent halls of the asylum, you're left with the quiet, chilling thought that in the Victorian world, sanity was a privilege, not a right. The imposing brick walls of the asylum are receding, and the chilling scent of antiseptic is replaced by something far more delicate, and in its own way, just as strange. From the realm of human confinement, we now step into a quieter, more personal obsession, a reflection of the Victorian love for both the domestic and the morbid. Your room is no longer a sterile lecture hall, but a quiet drawing room, the air filled with the silent presence of tiny, perfect, and very dead creatures. This is the world of taxidermy pets, a morbidly sweet practice that took the earlier obsession with exotic specimens and brought it right into the heart of the home. The Victorian era, with its sentimentality and its profound fear of loss, had an interesting relationship with its domestic animals. Pets, particularly dogs and cats, were moving from being simple working animals to beloved members of the family. The bond was real, and the grief over their loss was just as profound as for a human. But while there were elaborate rituals for human death, there was no equivalent for a beloved pet. So, the Victorians did what they did best. They invented a new and deeply strange way to mourn. They had their pets immortalised through taxidermy, preserving them not just as a memory, but as a permanent silent companion. The most mainstream historical fact of this era is the popularity of taxidermy as a way to preserve beloved pets. When a family dog or cat passed away, the immediate thought was not to bury it in the backyard, but to have it professionally stuffed and posed. A skilled taxidermist could create a lifelike replica of the animal, often posed in a familiar way. A dog sitting by the fireplace, a cat curled up on a cushion. The preserved pet would then be placed in a glass case, a kind of personal and permanent memento mori. It was a way to deny the finality of death, to keep a piece of a beloved friend physically present in the home. It was a strange, but for the Victorians, deeply emotional act. It was a bit like a modern-day memorial photo, but with the added touch of, a full-sized furry statue. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the creation of elaborate, often macabre dioramas featuring birds, and especially hummingbirds. While taxidermy pets were a common sight in homes, the collection and display of birds, particularly the tiny jewel-like hummingbirds, became a feverish passion. The Victorians were obsessed with exotic specimens, and the hummingbird, with its iridescent feathers and lightning-fast movements, was the ultimate prize. These tiny birds were hunted in staggering numbers and then arranged in elaborate scenes under glass domes. You might see a scene of hummingbirds hovering over a nest, or a flock of them perched on a miniature tree branch, all frozen in time. The most famous of these artists was Walter Potter, the same man who created the kitten's wedding we discussed earlier. He created entire miniature worlds for his taxidermy subjects, often with a morbidly whimsical tone. For example, he created a diorama of a dead kitten in a coffin, surrounded by a funeral procession of taxidermy frogs. It was a dark, unsettling kind of art, a strange blend of Victorian sentimentality and a fascination with the grotesque. The scholarly debate surrounding taxidermy pets and dioramas is a poignant one. Historians still argue whether this practice was a genuine expression of grief and love, or a reflection of a society that objectified and commodified nature. On one hand, you can see the taxidermy pet as a sincere act of love, a way to honour a beloved companion. The desire to keep a piece of a loved one, whether human or animal, is a universal human impulse. The taxidermists were often commissioned to capture the animal's personality, and the results were often touching and personal. On the other hand, the sheer scale of the hunting and collecting, particularly of hummingbirds, suggest a more rapacious and less sentimental motive. The birds were hunted to the brink of extinction simply to satisfy a collector's whim. They were not seen as living creatures with a right to exist, but as objects to be collected, a kind of exotic currency to be displayed. The debate asks us to consider whether the Victorians' love for nature was truly a love for nature, or simply a love for owning a piece of it. The Victorians' love for collecting went far beyond a few taxidermy birds. It was an entire culture of accumulation. People collected everything: butterflies, seashells, botanical specimens. The act of collecting was a way to impose order on the chaos of the natural world, a way to categorize and understand. The glass domes and glass cases that housed these collections were a physical manifestation of this desire for order. They were a way of containing a chaotic world and turning it into a beautiful static display. The dead hummingbird under the glass dome was no longer a living creature. It was a silent, beautiful object, a jewel to be admired and catalogued. The legacy of this obsession is all around us, from the great natural history museums of the world to the small amateur collections that still exist today. The Victorians, with their love for the grotesque and their boundless sentimentality, were the pioneers of a kind of morbid preservation. They were a society that was so deeply afraid of loss that they tried to stop time itself, to freeze life in its most beautiful moments and keep it with them forever. The silent, glass-eyed dog in the corner of the room is a testament to that fear, a strange and quiet monument to a love that could not and would not let go. And as you look at it, you're left with the uneasy feeling that in the Victorian world, even death was not an excuse to let go. The glassy-eyed taxidermy bird under its dome is a silent testament to a particular kind of obsession, the Victorian need to collect. From the preserved remains of a beloved pet, we now step back to a broader, more fundamental impulse that defined the era. The strange and all-consuming mania for amassing collections of all kinds. Your room, once filled with the silent presence of dead creatures, now feels like an ordered, meticulously curated space, filled with everything from seashells to postage stamps, each item a small piece of a larger global puzzle. The Victorians were a society obsessed with cataloguing and classifying the world around them. The Enlightenment had taught them that knowledge was power, and the Industrial Revolution had provided them with the means to acquire, transport, and display objects from every corner of the globe. This created a perfect storm for a culture of collecting that went far beyond mere hobby. It was a form of intellectual and social currency, a way to demonstrate one's knowledge, worldliness, and, of course, wealth. The most mainstream historical fact of this obsession is the rise of amateur scientific collecting. The Victorians didn't wait for professional scientists to bring them the world, they went out and found it themselves. Young men and women would spend their weekends collecting butterflies and beetles, pressing botanical specimens and gathering geological samples. The act of collecting was a respectable and educational pastime, a way to engage with the natural world in a meaningful way. It was a hobby that was promoted in popular magazines and books, which often provided instructions on how to properly mount a butterfly or classify a rare beetle. The collector's cabinet, a piece of furniture with dozens of small drawers, became a common sight in middle-class homes. The collections themselves were often not just for personal enjoyment, they were a way to contribute to a larger body of knowledge. Many of the great museums of the world today were built on the foundations of these private amateur collections. It was citizen science, Victorian style. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the emergence of the philatelist, the stamp collector. While collecting was a long-standing pursuit, the Victorian love for it extended to the most mundane of objects. With the introduction of the penny black, the world's first adhesive postage stamp in 1840, a new mania was born. People began to collect these tiny pieces of paper, not just for their aesthetic value, but for their historical and geographical significance. The stamps were a miniature atlas of the world, each one a silent symbol of a far-flung corner of the British Empire or an exotic independent nation. This was a hobby that was accessible to people of all ages and classes. A young boy in London could trade stamps with a friend in a distant town, and in doing so he was engaging with a global network of commerce and communication. It was a strange but deeply symbolic way of connecting with the larger world. The scholarly debate surrounding Victorian collecting often centres on its motivations. Historians still argue whether the collecting mania was a noble pursuit of knowledge or a reflection of a materialistic and possessive society. On one hand, you can see it as an intellectually curious endeavour. The Victorians were living in a world of unprecedented discovery, and their collections were a physical manifestation of their desire to understand and categorise that world. The act of arranging a collection of seashells or butterflies was a way to impose order on the chaos of nature, to turn the wild and unpredictable into a neat and orderly display. The collection was a source of pride and a way to share knowledge with others. On the other hand, the collecting mania was often driven by a materialistic and possessive impulse. The most valuable collections were often those that contained the rarest and most exotic items, and the pursuit of these items often led to a kind of frenzied, destructive competition. People were willing to pay vast sums of money for a single rare orchid or a unique butterfly, and they were often willing to destroy a whole ecosystem to get it. The debate asks us to consider whether the Victorians' love for knowledge was at its core a love for ownership. The culture of collecting was also deeply tied to the era's social norms. A collection was a way of publicly displaying your taste, your intellectual curiosity, and your social standing. A grand collection of Roman coins or ancient Egyptian artifacts was a clear sign of wealth and education. The most prestigious collections were often housed in a special room, a cabinet of curiosities, where guests would be invited to admire the owner's taste and knowledge. The collection was a source of conversation, a way to show off your worldly knowledge without seeming ostentatious. It was a subtle form of social signalling, a way of saying, I am a person of consequence, and here is the physical proof. The legacy of the Victorian collecting mania is all around us. The great museums, from the British Museum to the Smithsonian, were built on the backs of these early collectors. The passion for collecting, in all its forms, is still with us today, whether it's for comic books, baseball cards, or fine art. The Victorians were the first to truly turn collecting into a cultural phenomenon, and in doing so they created a new way for us to interact with the world. They taught us that objects can tell a story, that a collection can be more than the sum of its parts, and that the act of organising and categorising can be a source of profound satisfaction. But they also taught us that the pursuit of a rare object can lead to a kind of destructive obsession. So as you look at that beautiful, meticulously arranged collection of stamps, you're left to wonder if the price of order was worth the pursuit. The quiet, meticulous order of the stamp collection is a fragile shield. From the benign mania of collecting, we now transition to a far more charged and historically weighty obsession, the Victorian fascination with acquiring and displaying relics. Your room, once filled with the hushed order of a collection cabinet, now feels ancient and sacred, the air thick with the faint scent of dust, old stone, and the unsettling presence of objects that hold a profound and sometimes gruesome history. The Victorians, with their boundless faith in progress, were also a society that was deeply tied to the past. The rise of archaeology and history as academic disciplines, coupled with an imperialist impulse to save and catalogue the artefacts of other cultures, created a thriving market for historical and religious relics. This wasn't just about collecting beautiful or rare objects, it was about owning a piece of a story, a tangible link to a heroic figure or a sacred event. For the Victorians, a relic was a kind of a time machine, a way to touch and feel the past. The most mainstream historical fact of this obsession is the widespread plundering of ancient sites and tombs under the guise of archaeology. Men like Giovanni Belzoni, a kind of proto-archaeologist and showman, would descend on ancient Egyptian sites, often using brutal and destructive methods to unearth mummies, sarcophagi and statues. These artefacts were then shipped back to Europe and sold to wealthy private collectors or donated to museums. The British Museum's Egyptian collection is a direct result of this era, and its existence is a testament to the Victorian belief that these artefacts belong to them, not to the cultures that created them. The Victorians saw themselves as enlightened custodians of a global heritage, and the act of taking these objects was, in their minds, a noble act of preservation. Of course, it was also a form of sanctioned theft, a way to add an exotic historical cachet to their collections. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this obsession is the thriving market for fake and fraudulent relics, particularly those with religious or historical significance. With a public appetite for relics that far outstripped the supply, a massive industry of forgers and charlatans sprang up. You could, for a price, acquire a genuine splinter from the true cross, a lock of hair from a saint, or a piece of armour from a medieval knight. These fakes were often beautifully crafted and sold to a gullible public, eager to own a piece of a sacred or heroic past. The most famous example is the widespread sale of so-called mummy bandages, which were, more often than not, just old linen soaked in a chemical to make them look ancient. The fact that a relic was likely a fake didn't seem to bother most people. The act of owning it, the feeling it gave you, was more important than its historical authenticity. It was a kind of religious or historical placebo effect, where the belief in the object's power was more important than the object itself. The scholarly debate surrounding the Victorian appetite for relics is a crucial one. Historians still argue whether the Victorians' love for relics was a genuine form of historical reverence or a fetishistic act of commodification. On one hand, you can see the collectors as true believers, people who saw these objects not as mere possessions, but as sacred links to a heroic past. The act of collecting and displaying them was a form of worship, a way to honour the saints, the heroes, and the great civilizations of the past. It was a kind of romantic antiquarian impulse, a desire to restore a connection to a world that felt increasingly distant and modern. On the other hand, the relics were also a form of currency, a way to show off wealth and social standing. The most valuable collections were those that contained the rarest and most historically significant items, and the collectors would go to extreme lengths, often with little regard for the object's cultural context, to acquire them. The debate asks us to consider whether the Victorians were truly honouring the past, or simply using it as a prop for their own social performance. This macabre fascination with relics also extended to a truly gruesome kind of acquisition, the skeletal remains of people deemed historically significant. It was a quiet extension of the fascination with phrenology and criminology, a belief that a person's genius or villainy could be read from the shape of their skull. The bones of famous figures, from poets to murderers, were often exhumed and put on display in private collections or museums. It was a kind of ultimate collecting, a desire to own not just a piece of history, but the physical remnants of a person who made it. It was a morbid, but for the Victorians, deeply compelling way of connecting with the past. The legacy of this obsession is all around us. The great museums of the world, with their vast collections of ancient artefacts, are a direct result of this era. The desire to own a piece of history, whether it's an authentic artifact or a clever reproduction, is still with us today. The Victorians, in their tireless quest to understand, own and display the world, created a culture of collecting that was as insatiable as it was fascinating. They were a society that was so afraid of the past slipping away that they tried to capture it, to contain it in a glass case, and to keep it with them forever. And as you leave this final, hallowed space, you're left with the quiet, unsettling feeling that the past, for the Victorians, was not just a memory, it was a possession. The final images of the Victorian world are fading now. The jet-black veils, the ghostly knock of the séance table, the quiet, glassy eyes of the taxidermy pet, the cold marble of the asylum, the steel-boned corset, and the ancient silent relics. It was a world of profound contradictions, pious yet morbid, scientific yet superstitious, refined yet grotesque. They were a people who, in their relentless pursuit of progress, were also consumed by a deep-seated fear of death, a fascination with the bizarre, and a relentless desire to own and categorize the world around them. So now, as the last gaslight flickers out and the silence of your room returns, take a moment to reflect on the strangeness of it all. In their obsessive rituals, their macabre hobbies, and their endless collections, the Victorians were just trying to make sense of a world that was changing faster than they could comprehend. They were trying to create order out of chaos, to find beauty in the morbid, and to hold on to a past that was slipping away. They did it in a very strange way, but in their own way, they were just like us, trying to find a way to make sense of it all. Now, let that strange, dusty world recede. Close your eyes. Let the sounds of the night, whatever they may be a gentle blanket over your thoughts. Feel your own breath, slow and steady. The past is the past, and it is in a beautiful, strange, and slightly terrifying place. But you are here now, safe,